Kayena vacha manasendriyarva buddhyatmanava prakritir swabhavat karomi yadyat sakalam parasmai narayanayeti samarpayami. Whatever I do with my body, speech, mind, and senses, by my intellect, self, or nature, all these I offer to the Supreme Lord, Narayana. Good morning. You people braved the first day of December. So today, we're going to talk about Dr. Seuss. His whole name was Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. He was an American children's author, political cartoonist, illustrator, poet, animator, screenwriter, and filmmaker. He published over 60 books. He was born in 1904 and died in 1991. Many of his stories are actually social commentary and moral, ethical poking. Like Swamiji, he was interested in building character. In Vedanta, character building is usually presented within the framework of the 5 abstentions and the 5 disciplined observances of Raja Yoga. But here we're going to follow a different approach, children's stories. Childlikeness, simplicity, and straightforwardness are frequently the traits of Seuss's main characters. According to the Gita, one of the qualities of those born with a divine destiny is this straightforwardness. Now, this may seem like a digression, but it's really not. From Albert Einstein, a message from the most famous scientist of the 20th century. The true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. So I wanted to show that both from the scientific side and from the artistic side, imagination is a very important thing. So Dr. Seuss says, fantasy is a necessary ingredient in living. It's a way of looking at life through the wrong end of a telescope. And that's exactly what he did in his stories. He livened things up, misordered things so that they could come back into order, etc. So to induce this sense of fantasy, Seuss usually uses a meter in which each line represents a pattern of stressed, unstressed, stressed syllables 4 times, for a total of 12 syllables. Children, are quite literal, and they love sing-song stories, so this fits in perfectly. It's easier to memorize them and repeat without knowing how to read. So some kids, way before they can read, they know they've memorized various kinds of things, and Seuss is one of them. Sometimes the content is just crazy, and he uses a lot of made-up language. But that also induces a sense of fantasy because it's not of this normal reality that we experience. Reality in quotation marks. Also, Seuss uses animal characters in the tradition of folk tales all over the world. Somehow it seems to make the message more accessible because people wouldn't behave like that. Of course not. So another thing from Einstein. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And I'm sure he's speaking from experience because apparently he didn't even speak until he was like 3 or 4 years old or something like that. And people thought he wasn't going to amount to much. Certainly everybody thinks that their own kid is a genius, at least before they start school, which nowadays may be as toddlers. And children do have an innate intelligence, which unfortunately prolonged contact with society usually stifles. But therefore, we frequently have lost our ability to think and wonder and think. And this is what Seuss brings back. Little children see things that we don't see as adults. and they're fascinated by things that we lightly dismiss. Furthermore, as adults, our halos can droop quite considerably. We rationalize why we give in to the mob mentality, conform to less than stellar norms, lower our standards for the sake of money, group peace, career advancement, government grants, prestige, social acceptance or mobility, etc., etc. So today's roster of characters deal with sort of realistic problems, albeit exaggerated. And so today we're going to look at the Sneetches, the Lorax, Horton the Elephant in 3 different roles, Thidwick, the big-hearted moose, and the Grinch. Now that's a lot for one day. I probably will run over. In our first story, we see how in-group cohesion needs to be broken for the sake of a more equal society. So this is the Sneetches. This was written in 1961, just prior, or I should say the decade of the Equal Rights Amendment and lots of civil disturbance and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and all of that. So it was very much a sign of the times. Now, in this picture, I don't know if you can see, look very closely. These Sneetches have little green stars on their tummies. Can you see that? Okay. Now, the Sneetches with stars considered themselves to be very superior, especially to Sneetches who had no stars. So they kept those no-star Sneetches away, never let them come near, and that's how they treated them year after year. They didn't invite them to parties or picnics or anything. They wanted to be completely separate. So, knowing this and seeing a business opportunity, Sylvester McMonkey McBean decides to do something about it. So he decides to make starless Sneetches acceptable by giving them stars. So you see they're going into his machine, paying their money on one end with no stars and coming out with stars on the other, and they're so happy. Now, when the starred Sneetches find out what's going on, they decide that they need to continue to keep separate, so they have him remove their stars. So now they can be superior to the Sneetches that have stars. But they keep going through this machine continuously until eventually the Sneetches have all gone through the machine so many times, having stars put on and removed, that Sylvester becomes rich. So here he is, taken off with all his money. And he laughed as he drove his car up the beach. They never will learn, no, you can't teach a Sneetch. But he was wrong, because that day all the Sneetches forgot about stars and whether they had one or not upon theirs. So there's a happy ending to this story, and it points out, of course, the ridiculousness of segregating human populations based on insignificant externals. Now, our second story is the Lorax. It first appeared in 1971, and it's one of Seuss's most famous works and perhaps his most controversial, at least at that time. Nowadays, I don't think it would be considered controversial at all. It was published just as global environmental awareness was beginning in the early 1970s. The Lorax is still pointed to as a foundational eco-political text. The fable pits capitalism against biodiversity. It's the sobering tale of the avaricious Mr. Onceler, who, seduced by wealth, fells yarn-producing trifula trees to knit lucrative thneeds. As the forests and wildlife crumble and disappear, the Lorax, who speaks for the trees, pleads for the preservation of his ecosystem. Much later, as the story goes, after the Lorax has disappeared, a little boy who wants to learn about the Lorax goes to the old Onceler's home to hear the story. The Onceler tells the boy it all began long ago when there was an abundance of brightly colored trifula trees and no pollution. The Onceler concentrated on expanding his business, adding to the factory, shipping more and more product, and making more and more money. In telling this story to the little boy, the Onceler assured him, "I meant no harm, I most truly did not, but I had to grow bigger, so bigger I got." The Lorax complained continually about the pollution from the factory and how it was affecting the animals' ability to live there. But Mr. Onceler grew tired of the Lorax's complaints and angrily yelled at him. Aren't they adorable little animals? And in no time of all, quote, "in the factory I built, the whole Onceler family was working full tilt. We were all knitting thneeds, just as busy as bees, to the sound of the chopping of trifula trees." Finally, they heard the sound of the very last trifula tree falling. Of course, with no more trifula trees available, the factory closed. All the Onceler's relatives left. The Lorax left. What remained was the Onceler, an empty factory, and pollution. The Lorax disappeared, leaving only a small pile of rocks with the one word, "unless." For years, the Onceler wondered and worried about what that meant. Now he tells the young boy he finally understands. The now remorseful Onceler closes with a mournful exhortation. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. But hope glimmers faintly in the book's final passages. The Onceler throws a very last trifula tree seed down to the boy and tells him he's in charge. He needs to plant the seed and protect it. Then maybe the Lorax and the other animals will return. Indeed, nowadays, we do find all over the world that when people come together, they can repair environmental degradation within a relatively short period of time. Now, switching to the most beloved character I think that Seuss came up with, Horton the Elephant. He's captivating in his simplicity. Horton is a kind, sweet-natured elephant who cares about other animals and people. The story juxtaposes the worlds of the very large and the very small. This is Horton Hears a Who. Horton is enjoying the cool of the pool when he hears a small noise. Eventually, he determines that it's coming from a small speck of dust in the air with someone on it who's afraid of falling into the pool. Elephants are said to be very intelligent, so he places the speck of dust on a clover. Now, I want to remind you that mystics frequently hear things that no one else does, and they suffer a similar fate as Horton. The kangaroo, who's one of his main antagonists, says, "He talks to a dust speck. He's out of his head." The monkeys say, "This elephant's talking to who's who are not." Horton decides that he's got to protect the who's from others who arrogantly don't believe in their existence. Well, there's more and more of this until eventually an eagle carries the clover away and Horton follows. The eagle drops it into a patch of clover 100 miles wide. Horton searches, asking each one, "Hello, are you there?" He finds them on the 3 millionth flower. Now, you'll notice that Horton is unusually tenacious. According to Swami Vivekananda, every successful person must have behind him somewhere tremendous integrity, tremendous sincerity, and that is the cause of his signal success in life. He may not have been perfectly unselfish, yet he was tending toward it. So finally, all those enemies of Horton decide to cage the elephant and boil the clover flower. Horton hears that, and he hears the who's, but the others don't hear the collected voice, as by now all the who's are screaming. And the animals actually beat up on Horton. Then the Who's on the spec create a great racket with everything they can muster, because the Who's absolutely have to prove that they're there. Now I'm going to go into a little digression here, because frequently you might look very hard, but frequently the solution is not on this level, but on the next level up. So I'm going to point out here that we have in Vedanta, in terms of our personal makeup, presumably 5 identifiable bodies or sheaths or layers, whatever you want to say, starting with on the outside, the physical body, then the energy body, mental, and then wisdom body, and finally the bliss body. When all of these are aligned, the person is said to be integrated. But on our level now, when I came across this quote a few years ago, it was like a huge aha for me, so I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not sure of the source, unfortunately. It may have been Sri Nisargadatta, but what is said is, an emotion is the residue of a misplaced sensation. I'm going to repeat that. An emotion is the residue of a misplaced sensation. If you really think about it, you'll find that that is true. Now, this system of 5 koshas applies to personal problems, not necessarily societal problems. But an emotional problem is energetic. So wherever the problem appears, we have to go to the next interior level to solve it. So an emotional problem should be handled on the mental level. And a mental problem should be handled on an intellect level. And an intellect problem should be handled on a holistic level. So what I'm saying, or implying at least to a large extent, is that not everything can be handled on a spiritual level by an unintegrated person, which is to say, most of us, most of the time. That is, to try and skip the intervening levels and pray about it does not necessarily always work, because it's an unintegrated person who's praying. I'm not saying don't pray, I'm just saying don't expect miracles right away. Because prayer does work. But anyway, what is the quality of a prayer of an unintegrated person? And what is the status of personhood in Vedanta anyway? This is a topic for another time. But let me leave you with one quote from Swamiji. Practice truthfulness. 12 years of absolute truthfulness in thought, word, and deed. Give a man what he wills. So back to our story. The Who's now take to making all kinds of noise with all these fantastic instruments they have. The mayor cried, "This is your town's darkest hour, the time for all Who's who have blood that is red to come to the aid of their country," he said. "We've got to make noises in greater amounts." Now it turns out that there was one who was totally uninvolved, and he's just quietly bouncing his yo-yo. And the mayor grabs him and climbs up to the top of the Eiffelberg Tower, where the kid finally opens his mouth and shouts. And sure enough, that does the trick. Everyone around Horton hears the Who's, finally. Horton's mantra through this whole thing is a person's a person, no matter how small. By extension, we can say no matter how fat, how disabled, how mentally challenged, how old, how badly we speak your language, how dark your skin is, you get the point. In this way, this book promotes a lesson of equality. In a way, in my personal life, not that I've perfected it yet, but this was my first practical and major lesson in Vedanta. Not tolerance, but unconditional acceptance. The kangaroo the previous leader of the naysayers says to Horton, finally, "From now on, I'm going to protect them with you." So Horton's tenacity has effected a conversion. Now for some more animal hijinks. We have Thidwick, the big-hearted moose. This story depicts a problem that the Vedanta Society is well acquainted with. Seuss stresses a situation, or creates a situation, in which ungrateful people take advantage of other people's kindness and generosity. Thidwick is a kind of brainless and soft-hearted, and he's a perfect mark for ingrates. And Seuss often depicts such characters. Thidwick was just going along, munching his moose moss, when an insect asks him whether he could ride on his antlers. Well, fine. Yeah, that's fine with Thidwick. He says, well, I don't mind. Not at all. Come on. But then as they go along, the insect invites a friend, who invites another friend, who invites another friend, etc. And the kind-hearted moose acquiesces to the unexpected influx of guests. He calls them guests, even though he never told them explicitly that they were allowed to live there. Eventually, all the other moose in the herd give Thidwick an ultimatum. If he doesn't get rid of the guests, then he will have to leave the herd. Then Thidwick's sense of decency compels him to forego the comforts of herd life in favor of indulging his guests, and his herd leaves him behind. Inevitably, winter comes, and the herd swims across the lake to find fresh supplies of moose moss. Thidwick wants to do the same, but his guests object and insist that Thidwick not take, quote, their home to a far distant side of the lake. Poor Thidwick sank down with a groan to his knees, and then came something that made his heart freeze. To add insult to injury, see Thidwick's up there in the upper right, some hunters decide that this unusual grouping that you saw previously would make a very good trophy. So they chase him with his heavy load until he finally realizes that he need not carry it any further, because today is the day that moose shed their antlers. At the last moment, he drops his antlers, makes a snide comment to his former guests, and escapes by swimming across the lake to rejoin his herd. His former guests are captured by the hunters and are stuffed and mounted, still perched on his antlers, on the trophy wall of the Harvard Club. So there's Thidwick. Now there's one flaw to this story. Did anybody find it? Animal knowledge, animal knowledge. Anybody know? Moose do not go in herds. Okay, so Horton Hatches the Egg. This is the first time that Horton appeared. This was in 1940. Long before, he kept using the same character over and over after that. In this story, a bird named Maisie talks Horton into sitting on her egg while she flies off for a vacation in Palm Beach. They said that Maisie was lazy, but maybe she wasn't cut out for motherhood. Some people don't discover that until it's too late. Now, fancifully enough, since we're talking about fantasy here, in a proposed sequel, let's propose a sequel, maybe Maisie abandoned her egg because she was the victim of domestic violence and she just had to get out of there. We don't know that. In any case, there's no doubt or suspicion on Horton's part. I'm sorry, I skipped one. He very carefully took his place on the nest. Everybody thought he was crazy, all the other animals, of course. These people according to the Gita, can be mildly or utterly demonic, asura sampat, or at the very least, showing ill will and sneering. Some people just want to take you down, no matter what. But you can't deter someone with a real mission. Horton sat, and he sat, and he sat, and he sat. Nobody could sit better than that. Now, he's demonstrating some qualities that are, according to the Hindu scriptures, very necessary for a spiritual aspirant. Dhriti, firmness, steadiness, will. Kshama, forbearance, patient endurance. And mardavam, gentleness and kindness. His mantra throughout this ideal: I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. Horton patiently sits on the egg, repeating this as necessary. Horton's adherence to truth makes him completely reliable. Now, this is a little bit of a stretch here, but I found this quote from Swami Vivekananda about his own life in the talk that he gave, My Life and My Mission. He's talking about himself and his fellow monastic brothers in the years after Sri Ramakrishna passed away. Thus we went on for some years, in the meanwhile making excursions all over India, trying to bring about the idea gradually. 10 years we spent without a ray of light. 1,000 times despondency came. But there was one thing always to keep us hopeful: the tremendous faithfulness to each other, the tremendous love between us. In happiness, in misery, in famine, in pain, in the grave, in heaven or in hell, who never gives me up is my friend. If we have that faithfulness, why, there is the essence of all concentration. You need not worship any gods in the world if you have that faith, that strength, that love. And that was there with us all throughout that hard time. That was there. So here's Horton finally, as proof of his resolve. He looked at the hunters as much as to say, shoot if you must, but I won't run away. Now, I cannot recall why the hunters did not shoot him, but they didn't. Maybe they were impressed. I don't know. Finally, after a very long time, whoa, why is it doing 2 at a time now? There rang out the noisiest ear-splitting squeaks from the egg that he'd sat on for 51 weeks. A thumping, a bumping, a wild, alive scratching. My egg, shouted Horton, my egg, why it's hatching. Notice the possessiveness. It is now his egg. But at that very instant, the egg burst apart, and out of the pieces of red and white shell from the egg he'd sat on so long and so well, Horton the elephant saw something whiz. It had ears and a tail and a trunk just like his. This eventually came to be called the Morton bird. The Morton bird. A completely new creation, the result of so much sitting, which you might say in what they call in creative circles, incubation. So he incubated a whole new creation. In the end, this Morton bird goes to live with Horton in the jungle. Next story, Horton and the Quagga bug. In this story, Seuss juxtaposes honesty and deception. I mean, he's done deception before, but the Quagga bug in this story is an out-and-out con man, a liar. The quaggerbug convinces Horton to take him to his bezelnut tree. And Horton agrees, since when they get there, the bug promises that Horton will get half the nuts. But the bug is practiced at mityachara, that is, hypocrisy. The bezelnut tree is far, far away, and Horton has to swim rivers and climb a mountain, with the bug arrogantly commanding him and goading him on and denigrating him to boot. "Climb, you dumb elephant, climb." Now, con men convince themselves that some people deserve to be taken advantage of. But on Horton's part, he keeps reminding himself, a deal is a deal, and I cannot back out. This shows his determination, resolve, purpose, or intention, all of which are explicated in the Gita quite nicely. Now the con is revealed. Here's Horton stretching from the top of one mountain to the other so that the quaggerbug can get over to the bezelnuts. And according to the quaggerbug, when Horton asks for his share, half of the nut is the meat and half is the shell. So, as Horton's portion, he stuffs all the shucks up Horton's nose. But in the end, Horton sneezes and blows that bug so far away that he's never able to get back to that tree. Horton may be gullible, but he frequently wins in the end. Now, next to Horton, or maybe even more than Horton, because this guy is really, really famous. He's on the tube every year. And according to sources, they say that The Grinch was actually Dr. Seuss's autobiography. Next to Mr. Scrooge, he's probably the most famous of all Christmas story characters. Now, it's much better if you actually watch the cartoon, but the Grinch lived outside of the town of Whoville, as far away from people as he could get. A quintessential misanthrope. They say that his heart was 3 sizes too small. In particular, at this wintry season, he couldn't stand the sounds of merriment coming from the town below. So after quite a bit of time, he just had to do something to prevent Christmas from coming. He resolved, I'm going to prevent Christmas from coming this year. He thought very hard for a very long time. Then he got an idea, an awful idea. The Grinch got a wonderful, awful idea. And he just enjoys his own wickedness for a while before getting into actually doing something about his idea. So here he is with his dog Max, and he sets to work. He intends to impersonate Santa, but in reverse. That is, he's going to remove everything associated with the holiday. So he makes himself a costume, he dolls up like Santa, he forcibly turns his dog into a reindeer, a single reindeer, and on Christmas Eve he launches into his exploit. So here he is going down a chimney with an empty sack, each chimney, I should say, in Whoville, and enjoying himself immensely as he stuffs everything into the sack. ornaments, decorations, presents. I think he even stuffs the roast beast in there, which he loathes, roast beast, that they eat on Christmas Day. And in this picture, he's even got the tree under his arm, and he's sneaking around each house gleefully. Of course, the dog doesn't know what's going to happen. And finally, one of my favorite, what can you say, lines from the whole story, he stuffs the tree up. Now, it just so happens that Cindy Lou Who, all of age 2, wakes up and finds an ornament that has rolled away. She asks why he is taking their Christmas tree. He thinks up a lie, and he thinks it up quick. Quote, "There's a light on this tree that won't light on one side, so I'm taking it home to my workshop, my dear. I'll fix it up there, and I'll bring it back here." And of course, the child just goes along with that. Now, we teach children not to lie, and then we lie to them all the time. It's no wonder that they rebel. Finally, when everything is stashed on his sleigh, he returns to his mountaintop lair with all the household holiday accoutrement, and he waits to hear the sounds of wailing wafting up from the town. But instead, the next morning, he hears singing. All the Who's have assembled in the town square, and they're singing a welcome Christmas song. He realizes with a jolt that he didn't stop Christmas from coming at all. He realizes that Christmas isn't about stuff, but it's about relationships. It's about affirming our common humanity and celebrating the joy of living, even at a time of year when life becomes a bit more difficult. They say his heart grew 3 sizes that day. So he realizes what he's done. He gets his dog, Max, reloads the sleigh, and races back down the mountain to put everything right. Thus, he engages in restitution, which is to put the other party right back where they should be. But in actuality, it does more for the person who's engaging in the restitution because they're putting themselves right. So he demonstrates that no one is beyond redemption, or at least almost no one. There might be some. And he ends up eating roast beef with his other Who's in Whoville. Because you see, the Grinch actually is also a Who. He's just an unusual Who. I'm going to invite everybody to come over to the living room, and we'll talk about, there's a lot of themes in here that I didn't want to digress into, but we can certainly explore them together. And so I'm closing a little early. Om Tat Vishnu Paramam Padam Sada Pashyanti Srayaha Divi Vachakshuratatam. Om, as with eyes open, one sees the sky before him, so the seers see always the supreme truth, the all-pervading existence. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso ma jyotir gamaya mrityor ma amritam gamaya Airavir ma edi. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness into light and from death to immortality.